Hey, welcome back to my channel. It's Christine Grace, and today I have something very exciting lined up. I am doing a one-to-one interview with Dr. David Baker. Just to give you a bit of background, Dr. David Baker, he is originally from Canada and now he is living in Australia. So I guess let's just get straight into it. Could you tell everyone a bit about your background, your sort of early life, and where it's led you to the position that you're in now?
Okay, sure. As I mentioned, family of musicians, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I went into a rather interesting field of history, which is a mix of hard science and social science. So originally, I was engaged in a field called cliodynamics, which is looking for mathematical patterns in human history over the course of, say, several centuries, a couple of millennia at tops. That was some interesting, rewarding work. I twinned that with a lot of evolutionary biology and anthropology to give sort of a broad spectrum look at patterns in deep time, a sort of bird's eye view of history.
Okay.
So I did that through my master's and PhD, and proceeded to look at the whole shebang. So we're talking physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, geology, and 300,000 years of human history. And my first trade book, not my first book, but my first trade book that appears in bookstores, was a history of the universe from 13.8 billion years ago to modern day, and sort of the unifying patterns of complexity from the first subatomic particles to complex societies, plus a look at where humanity might go in the future and where the cosmos might go in trillions and trillions of years until heat death.
Oh, so
From
you think heat death? Sorry, I have to stop you there. You think heat death is the most probable outcome? Because I know that there's the sort of top three. You've got heat death, the big stretch, I believe it was, and the big crunch, if I'm not
the big
mistaken.
rip,
The
the
big
big
rip.
rip is, yeah, is the, and actually there's four
Oh,
potential
okay.
outcomes. So the data currently indicates heat death, and that's just based on how fast we think the universe, its expansion is accelerating.
Hmm.
So in the heat death scenario, essentially the universe just lives on and on and on for trillions of years, a virtual eternity, until matter itself dissolves back into energy
Hmm.
in about 10 to the power of 40 years. And even black holes eventually evaporate in 10 to the power of 100, roughly speaking. Big rip is when the universe, its expansion accelerates so fast that the strong and weak nuclear forces holding atoms together become overpowered, and atoms themselves are sheared apart. And that
Yeah.
happens on a much quicker time scale over the course of the next 20 billion years. And so if we refined our data as to how fast the universe is accelerating, that might be in the near future. As for the big crunch, that is the most poetic ending. Um, Birth and rebirth, there's a big bang, and then there's an expansion, and then a contraction, and another big bang. Most people find a bit of comfort in that idea, but it is unfortunately the least likely, because that would require the universe to decelerate, and that is just not happening. Now, the fourth scenario is a little interesting, because the three previous scenarios all involve just the natural processes of the universe at a cosmological scale. But when you consider the accelerating rise of technology and complexity within a human civilization, and if you will just assume that, we don't wipe ourselves out, and it just continues to grow in complexity over the course of not thousands, but millions, trillions of years. So
Hmm.
take the last 200 years of advancement and multiply it on an exponential scale. And maybe it's not us, maybe it's some other advanced civilization in one of the other 400 billion galaxies in the universe. Eventually, odds might be that you get what's called a super civilization, capable of manipulating the physics of the universe itself, thus avoiding all of the natural disasters that would ultimately destroy any complexity, any super civilization ever. This would require, of course, sort of power and technology so profound that it could undermine the most ironclad law in all of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, which is
Yeah.
what condemns us to heat death, which
Yeah.
seems unlikely, but we're talking immense godlike power in some sort of civilization that controls the power of all the stars in a galaxy or more. So anyway, that's potential scenario 4, which perhaps is, in terms of likelihood, is even below the big crunch.
I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, how likely is that one to happen? But yeah,
And that one's called the big save.
the big save. That's almost more poetic than the big crunch. Amazing. I mean, I'm definitely going to be picking your brain on some of your physics knowledge because I'm absolutely fascinated by all of those topics.
I taught this stuff for a good 10 years at university. But anyway, then the other broad spectrum view that I did was recently a 2 billion year history of sex.
Yes.
So sex from its first evolution in microscopic cells 2 billion years ago, all the way through our family tree down to humans. So where all the genitals and instincts and eventually cultural tropes came from surrounding sex and relationships up to modern day, with an eye toward the near future.
Yes, and that book is available now, isn't it? It's called
Sex.
Book for the audience.
Sure. Sex, 2 billion years of procreation and recreation. My publishers just liked the idea of calling the book Sex. So there you go. And it's out now at all fine booksellers everywhere. You can get it on Amazon. There's a Kindle one, and I think there's an audiobook coming out in a couple of months. Oh, and it's available in bookstores in the US and UK just in time for Valentine's Day.
There you have it, guys. Perfect. Get your sex books ready for Valentine's Day. So yeah, I do want to definitely delve into your book. Could you give, for the people listening who aren't aware of it, could you give a sort of brief breakdown of what exactly it is that you're looking into? I know you mentioned obviously you look at the family tree of human history and how that's sort of developed into modern day. Some people may not know what exactly that looks like, but could you tell us maybe some patterns that you've noticed, maybe things that have changed or maybe some things that have stayed the same?
Okay, sure. Well, I divided the book up into 3 parts. And by the way, this book is meant for public consumption, so there's a lot of cheesy jokes and I drop a few cuss words here and there. But the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is evolutionary foreplay, which essentially starts before the evolution of sex and starts with the very first life on Earth that appeared about 3.8 billion years ago, which cloned itself asexually, so no sexual intercourse required. And you just clone 100% of your DNA. And then I get into why and how living things were forced into a rather, in some respects, disadvantageous activity of 2 of them coming together and having sex and exchanging DNA. Right from a start, DNA, its whole thing is to replicate itself. So 100% is a win. Only replicating 50% isn't so much of a win. So to compromise that, there's got to be a major incentive.
Okay.
It turns out prevailing theory is we're all microbes at this point, so tiny single microscopic cells. And about 2 billion years ago, there was an event called the snowball Earth, and there have been several of those throughout geological history. And what this is it isn't just an ice age. It's where the ice caps of the Earth actually spread from the 2 poles and meet at the equator, encasing the entire Earth in ice. An average surface temperature is about -50 because the ice itself reflects the sunlight back into the atmosphere, away from the Earth, because white, of course, reflects light.
Yes. Yeah.
So that seems to have put a strain on early life, and it's around about then that sex emerges. And the leading hypothesis as to why is that because of the snowball Earth, certain microscopic species started to starve, and they might have started to eat each other. And because these cells, these primitive cells, have their DNA floating around within the cell, as opposed to being in a nucleus, 2 of those cells eating each other might have led to an accidental exchange of DNA, which would have kicked off the first sex event in an act of cannibalism. So it's a bit Hannibal Lecter, but that might be where it all began. And then forced into that sort of direction, all the advantages of sex, like more genetic diversity, sexual selection, some constraints on genetic mutation, all of those things might have actually come into being and then sped along the process and allowed us to become increasingly complex at a very rapid pace. So that's the beginning of sex. And then what I do for the rest of the book is I just follow it's you couldn't do everything in nature. So what I do is I just follow our direct ancestral lineage,
Okay.
going all the way back that far. So I'll follow. I go through the evolution of gonochorism, male and female genders in the Cambrian. I go through the evolution of the first proto penises when we shortly after we crawled onto land, the very first sexual selection, the very first examples of cuckoldry, the very first examples of violent competition between males for mates, going all the way through the dinosaurs and the our mammalian ancestors that coexisted with them, following through to the rise of mammary glands, kids being gestated inside the womb, the first orgasms, the evolution of the external penis and the clitoris. Then that brings us up pretty much to part 2 of the book, which is what the hell did I call it? Monkey business or something? No. Primate climax, which is
Primate
essentially
climax, okay.
yeah, where we're so the last 50 million years where we've evolved into um, uh, the old and new world monkeys and great apes and so forth. And so most of the bits and pieces, the physical bits are in place, but then we evolved our instincts. And so I track the story of how most primates in our direct ancestry were either
And when
promiscuous.
did this happen? Sorry, what sort of time period are we at now? So I know
We're at about
so
40 million years ago. So after the extinction of the dinosaurs, 20 million years later, the old and new world monkeys split apart.
okay.
The new world monkeys who were in the Americas a lot of them tended to be monogamous, but the old world monkeys tended to be either promiscuous or polygynous. Polygynous being one male, many females, and
Yeah,
most of the males are on the sidelines and shit out of luck.
right.
And those instincts prevailed for most of our evolutionary history, down to about 2 million years ago. And so that what that means is there's a lot of hard wiring in our system that is still there even today for polygynous and promiscuous impulses, which is why humans, although mostly monogamous, do
Mm.
have these other things lurking under the surface.
Is
That
there a link there between sort of why women are generally hypergamous? Is that because of that fact?
well, yes and no. The hypergamy also has something to do with monogamy, because if you're going to pair up with one male provider and protector, you're going to need him to be not only genetically fit, but
Mm.
also capable of providing. Whereas most males in most primates will impregnate a female and have very little to do with her or the offspring thereafter.
Right, okay.
In monogamous species, they have to dive in. And so for us, 2 million years ago, because of a sort of this is with Homo erectus, a massive jump in the size of our brains. You had two things aside from a rise of our intelligence. One, because the female vaginal canal did not expand to the same level as people's heads, birth became incredibly dangerous. A lot of mammalian species, females can drop out a baby with much greater ease, right? But not so with humans, and not with our ancestors going back 2 million years. Much more dangerous for the female. And the second thing is, because you've got bigger brains, these kids are helpless for longer. You look at a giraffe, that is born, it's walking within minutes.
Yeah.
Chimpanzees, they have kids. Those kids are fairly self-sufficient, scampering around within a few days. Human infants are defenseless pretty much for the first few years. And so the helplessness of the offspring and the dangers of birth necessitated the evolution of monogamy about 2 million years ago. And that became a very strong impulse. And so suddenly, the role of men in rearing offspring and the sexual selection that was applied to men became slightly different than just being top of the social hierarchy or being the biggest bruiser in the pack.
Right.
There were other traits that might indicate that a male might be a good father, a good provider, a good protector within a monogamous context. But of course, again, polygyny, promiscuity, always under the surface, already hardwired, which is why in most hunter-gatherer societies you see a minority practicing polygyny. Usually it's tribal chiefs. Promiscuity, cheating, that's all there already. And then even in the earliest civilizations, most of the elite in most of the earliest civilizations were polygynous because they could. They were powerful and they were rich and they could get away with it, ruling over a sort of mass of people who were monogamous for the most part.
So most people weren't monogamous so far as if we were looking at that sort of time period of human history.
Most people became monogamous after 2 million years ago, but you see flashes of polygyny and promiscuity. So most people in most hunter-gatherer societies are monogamous. Most people in the earliest ancient civilizations were monogamous. It seems to be a function of being powerful. If you're a powerful man, it was fairly universal up until just about 1,000 years ago that you might have multiple wives or concubines.
Right.
And even societies like Christian society, medieval Christian society, which focused on having one wife, which is a relic of ancient Rome, going back still further. Even then, like kings, it would be unusual for a king not to have a mistress. So
Right.
that's sort of de facto polygyny in a way. Yeah.
Okay. And then moving on to the third element of your book, what was that part?
Oh, that was cultural afterglow. So I already trespassed a little bit on that. And that's pretty much after Homo sapiens evolved, how all of our instincts sort of had this gentle dance with culture. Culture, of course, evolves very quickly. Our instincts, all our biology are already in being. We're basically the same animal today as we were 300,000 years ago. But what changes rapidly all the time is cultural practice. And so the third chapter looks at, hunter-gatherers and how things changed there. And then the last 12,000 years of agriculture and the last 5,000 years of civilization and the various cultures across the globe and how they conducted romance, sex, marriage, and how that affected wider society. Bringing us all the way up to the modern revolution 200 years ago, and the impact of, say, industrialization and what that had on marriage and couples and romance, ultimately leading into the sexual revolution and the state of play where things are today.
The state of play. Okay.
Mm.
And could you tell me a bit more about that? So I'm interested to see what's happening. And so you say that you had the modern revolution about 200 years ago. The state of play, when was that sort of the conception?
Oh, well, I just mean how things are right now. But essentially, you've got the sexual revolution kicking off in the early 60s. But really, we're talking about a massive change happening even earlier, about 1920, where social structures changed. And even then, people were becoming much more promiscuous. By the 1940s and 50s, after the Second World War in the West, most people were paying lip service at that point to the idea of no sex before marriage. So it's not like it was just a thing brought in by hippies in the 60s, the idea of free love. We were already, unless you were heavily religious, in the 1940s, 1950s, people were having sex before they got hitched. In fact, after the war, there was a huge proportion of brides were pregnant visibly on their wedding days. That's part of the baby boom generation. You had this spike in very rush marriages and people marrying much younger than, say, in the 1930s or during the war. And so, anyway, all of that sort of comes to fever pitch at the end of the 60s. And by the 1970s, you've got women flooding into the workplace, which has an effect on the birth rate because suddenly, if you're going from high school, maybe into college, but into the workforce in your 20s,
Mhm.
that cuts down on the amount of time that you're spending finding a family and getting married and having kids. Your fertility window, which
Yeah.
becomes it's much more difficult to have a kid after 30. And so what you see in every Western country, starting with Japan in the 1970s, is a nosedive of the fertility rate. And that has continued to drop until this day, to the point that places like Japan are going to lose 30% of their population by the end of the century. You see the same drop off in other Western countries, but it's slightly obscured by them compensating with mass immigration, which Japan has eschewed. They'd prefer to evaporate as a nation than bring in hordes of new people. Such is not the case in, say, the UK or the US or Canada or Australia, France, most EU countries in the western part. That is, where mass immigration is the only way that they prevent a labor shortage. And keep GDP growing and keep the tax base growing, so politicians can keep making promises and spending money
But ultimately,
in order
doesn't
to
that
get
mean
election.
that the population inevitably is still gonna this is you can tell me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't that just mean that the population is still going to go down? Because even
Yes.
when you have things like immigration and people coming in, I mean, that's unsustainable, isn't it? Because people can only come for so long, and then once they're here, surely once they're sort of in the culture and they're working as well, then chances are they're not even gonna be having kids either. At least not as
Oh,
much as
yes.
they would in their own countries.
No, no, you're very right. Absolutely correct. Within one generation, they enter into the same breeding patterns of people
Yeah.
already in the West. Within one generation, so we're not even talking their kids. A lot of the people who immigrate straight off the bat will, if they're young enough, enter into the same reproduction patterns as people already living in the West. So you need this constant stream of people to make up for the disappearing population, because we're well below replacement rate now, which means the native populations are actively shrinking. So yeah, they just need to come in more and more and more in order to compensate to, again, keep economies growing and keeping each individual nation competitive, essentially, with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I
Uh,
could be asking you to speculate a bit here, but, why do you think that is that, because you hear all the time, "Oh, we've got too many people on the planet and that we've got, overpopulation." That's clearly not the case, and this isn't just from speaking to you. This is, I see it all the time. Even Elon Musk is talking about it. You mentioned the replacement rate is completely dropping. Why do you
yeah.
think it is that the sort of politicians and everyone are telling us we're overpopulated? And why is it that they seem to not want to do anything to fix that problem? Because if the idea is money, and this is me just hypothesizing, if the idea is that they want money, they want people in the workforce and they want taxes, etc., etc., surely you need
Yeah.
more people to
Yes.
continue that rate of flow of money, right? So without the
Yes.
people coming into it, that whole thing fails. So why do you think it is that we're headed down this route and no one seems to be trying to change the narrative?
It's a matter of perspective. So if you were to look at humanity globally,
Mhm.
overpopulation is a slight worry. In that the developing world, although in most places the birth rates are slowing down, they're slowing down in Asia, they're slowing down in India, though there's most people there live at the margins. It's sort of a little scary that their birth rate continues to go above replacement rate. It's going strong in the Middle East, and it's still exploding in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where most people are still on the agrarian model. They haven't adjusted to the industrial model, which is a lot fewer kids. They're still having, like 4, 5, 6 kids, which is why, barring a Malthusian disaster, Africa's population is just going to grow and grow and grow until it crashes by the end of the century. There's people projecting that Nigeria will have a larger population than China by the end of the century.
Wow.
Um, when you consider the relative land area of either of those countries, it's sort of alarming. Never mind the distribution of wealth. Okay, but that's globally. So, by the end of the century, projections are somewhere between 10.5 billion and 13 billion people will be on the planet. Most of that coming from the developing world. most of that growth coming from the developing world. Our carrying capacity at current modes of production is well below either of those numbers. So that is a concern. However, aside from Africa, the birth rate is slowing down in most other places in the world. But that's a global perspective. But in the West, overpopulation is not our problem. Quite the opposite. It's
Yeah.
underpopulation. So that's where Elon Musk comes in when he says that that's the biggest threat right
Right.
now is underpopulation, shrinking populations. He's referring specifically to the industrialized, developed West, and also countries like Japan and South Korea. Um, a lot of disadvantages come with shrinking populations. Some of them we've already enumerated. The other is aging populations, where you've got this vast mass of old people who
Yeah.
can't work anymore being supported by a shrinking number of taxpayers. So retirement age, never mind, might get higher. It might go out the window, and people might be working until they're dead.
Yeah.
Um, and China isn't too far behind with that either, even though they are not quite as developed as the West. Quite, that's an understatement, but they're not as developed as the West.
Do you think they
So
foresaw this? When women, for example, started going into the workplace. I'm very much, in case you can't tell by my line of questioning, into the conspiracy side of things. But why? Surely they could have seen this coming. If you get everyone into the workforce, you've got everyone working, and like you said, it gets to a point where perhaps people are working right up until they're dead. Sure, you might make like lots of money in the meantime whilst everyone's in the workforce, but then it's going to get to a point where, well, everyone's dead, so they've got no one left to make the money from. I mean, do you think they saw this coming? And if so, then surely they must have a plan to get people to start breeding again, because you need people coming into it. I don't know. It might be a bit of a ridiculous question, but I'd like to know if you think there's an
my
answer to
my
it.
position is that government bureaucrats, private demographers, policymakers aren't that smart. So back in the 1970s, when this was kicking off,
Mhm.
and the birth rate was dropping, at the time, everyone was all worried about what's known as the population bomb. They were predicting
Yeah,
people were going to be starving by the end of the 80s or the early 90s.
yeah,
So they might have looked at a declining birth rate as a positive thing. They didn't know the long-term effects or how the exact pattern would happen. So no, I don't think there was any bureaucrat plotting this as a conspiracy back in the 1970s or 80s. But it was much more knee-jerk because they are all looking at sort of short-term gain. So what happens in the late 60s and early 70s when you've got a whole generation of women who are being told, you should go into the workforce straight out of school. You need to have a career. You need to have a job. You can have that and a family. You can have it all. And then the birth rate starts dropping. Well, what's the advantage to me as either someone in government or in the private sector? Well, if I'm in government, I've got twice as many people earning twice as many taxpayers. If I'm in the private sector, I've got twice as many employees, which means there's not going to be a labor shortage, which means I can actually drive down wages and been stagnating for the last 50 years. So where both sexes are now working and we're earning less, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult today to support a family on a single income.
yeah,
Because what we earn has just become less and less valuable because we just flooded the labor market. So that was good news for people in government and big business. Now, what immediately happened the decade after is they realized, oh, well, if everyone's in the workforce and the fertility rate is tanking, then within a generation, we're going to have a labor shortage anyway. The problem is going to correct itself, right? And people's wages will suddenly get better. We'll have to pay people more because there's going to be a smaller supply of labor because no one's having kids. So when that next generation comes around, what are we going to do? So what do they do in the 80s and the early 90s? They start ramping up their quotas for immigration to compensate. So again, it's just this short-term vision where we need to keep the GDP growing. We need to keep wage growth down
yeah.
because that's better for the overall growth of the economy. Not so good for the standard of living for the average man and woman, but it's good for those big numbers.
Mm.
So that's what happened in the 90s, and that's sort of the holding pattern we've been in ever since. Um, Fertility rates continue to drop, and we just need more and more people. We need to get more and more workers in the nest.
Yeah. I kind of worried that that was going to be your answer, but you know what? I'm
Yeah.
not really surprised that it's sort of just a knee-jerk reaction from them. Yeah, I mean, I think a good segue to go from this is to talk about, you know, how sort of other factors that might have come into why perhaps we're not reproducing anymore, why the replacement sorry, what was it? It was the replacement level?
Replacement rate. The
Replace
replacement rate is 2.1. The fertility rates in across the developed world have been dropping. In South Korea, it's particularly bad. It's below 1. I think it's 0.84. So that's a rapidly shrinking population.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. You
So
need
yeah,
two.
if we look at the West, right, and we're looking at places
Yeah.
like, you know, you mentioned the developed and industrial world. For
Yeah.
example, one thing I notice in my generation, I'm 23, so I'm talking people sort of 18 to 25. You know,
Sure.
when I talk to a lot of girls my age, something like a family is really not on the agenda. And there seems to be this general consensus of, like you said, oh, you can have it all. You know, you can
Mhm.
go get the degree, you can go get the job, and you can work the job until you're 30, and then you can have kids at 30. Another thing that, you know, you mentioned, which I have definitely noticed, is an increase in promiscuity.
Sure.
How do you think it is that we've got here, and how do you think, is there a way for it to turn around? Is there a way that people might go back to wanting things like families? Because I feel like the value of family in itself, at least in my generation, has completely died out. Like I don't know many people, at least girls my age, who are thinking along those lines. And the reason I specify, for the viewers, the reason I specify girls is because we're talking about fertility age, and for girls that 18 to 25 is an important time. So, you know, a guy might not be thinking of a family during that age, but it doesn't really matter if he's thinking along those lines or not, because he can turn around at 30 and get a girl pregnant who is in that age range. So just for context for the viewers, that's why I'm specifically coming for the girls, as I'm sure many people will say.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's you're certainly uh, correct in the attitude you described.
Mm,
Um, it's I would differ in that it's the same perceived wisdom that also animated the previous two generations of young women when they were around that age, 18 to 23. The idea that, okay, well, now is the time to find myself, to get a career going, to have fun, to date, not worry too much about getting married or anything like that until my late 20s, early 30s. When that's when you get serious about family and having kids, if you do at all.
mm,
Um, and of course, that puts you at a major disadvantage, both in terms of your odds of having children, but also just the odds of finding someone that you would actually like to settle down with
yeah,
full time.
yeah,
Um, it's no mystery that women are at their most sexually desirable and in their early to mid 20s.
yeah,
Um, as opposed to things getting a little tricky in their 30s. And as for fertility, really, once you hit the age of 30, your odds of conceiving one child drop below 50% for the first time. So that's not a good time to be getting started if you look at it in terms of basic biology.
yeah,
So that seems to have led, because the perceived wisdom is career then family,
mm,
career in 20s, 30s, family. Um, seems to have led to a rise in what's known as the involuntarily childless,
yes, yeah,
which is the percentage of adults who wanted to have kids. So we're not we're taking away the Chelsea Handlers of the world who say at least that they're happy they don't have kids.
yeah,
We're talking about the women who wanted to and didn't quite get it together. And every developed nation in the world, it is between 25 and 35% of adult women are involuntarily childless.
wow.
Yeah, particularly high in places like South Korea, but it's no slouch in somewhere like the United States or the UK.
And what's the
Um,
trajectory looking like? You know, do you think that that's
it's
getting
going to
worse?
go up. It's going to go up. Like the oft quoted statistic, you hear it everywhere, is oh, well, half of women are going to be single and childless by 2030. But
Yeah,
we're
I
talking
know
about
over here
today.
it's like 50.1% of women
Yeah.
in my generation will be single and childless by 30. I've heard that one a lot. I just, yeah, it shocks me, especially because obviously, you know, I work with Pearl and we do the pre-game panel. So we get a
Yeah.
lot of these, you know, girls, young girls my age who come on. Um and you say these numbers and it's just something's not registering, if that makes sense. Something's not quite getting there. And I don't know if it's perhaps just complete ignorance to their sort of mortality. Like they kind of just think, well, oh, you know, that sort of young mindset of, oh, I'm never gonna be old. Like I'm gonna be young forever. I don't know if it's that, or I don't know if there's some kind of other programming go on there that's perhaps prohibiting them from being able to see the future. Or is it just the state of culture now that everything's become so instant that perhaps in general people are just struggling to see past the next sort of 2 to 3 years?
Well, it's willful ignorance because you're talking about just in terms of pure statistics, and maybe you'll be one of the lucky ones, but just in terms of pure statistics, um, a horrifically depressing future awaiting you, um, and a lot of that is your own fault because of the decisions you made
Yeah,
in your early 20s, which those decisions are done now. So all
yeah,
you can really do for a lot of these people who come on the show is salvage the situation as best you can, which is it's a hell of a thing to admit those things to yourself. So a lot of people would just prefer to ignore it and keep blundering down the path and hope for the best. I see that in a lot of those guests where that you can just tell they've deliberately turned their ears off. They
mm,
don't want to confront the fact that their future might not be particularly bright, at least in terms of sex or relationships or children or family. Um, and and it's their own damn fault.
yeah.
So I can understand the willful ignorance. It's still not wise, but I can understand psychologically where that comes from.
Yeah, I guess that's always what intrigued me, you know, it's like, because it's very frustrating because, you know, a lot of people sort of come for Pearl, and I'm sure at some point those same kind of people will be coming for me because I'm saying the same things, you know, talking about these things. I just feel like a lot of people think, you know, oh, you're just trying to scare people and, you know, you're trying to make people feel bad for their decisions. It's like, no, no, no. The reason this stuff is why would I want to say come on the internet and tell women like, yeah, go chase all of these things that are going to lead to you being single and childless, because it's like they might not know that they want to have kids now, but I don't know, I'm not 60, but I could imagine being 60 and having no significant partner in your life and no children as a woman is probably a fairly lonely place to be. I'm sure there is exceptions of people who love that, but I don't think it's the majority. I think
Well,
not a nice
Chelsea Handler speaks very highly of her Monday afternoon white wine passouts on the couch. So at least one person's happy. But the fact is that some things are scary, some realities are scary, and you have to be accountable for your actions.
yeah.
So, I mean, if someone you knew just took up heroin, and
Mm,
would you be afraid to tell them about the scary future that potentially awaited, or pointing out that they made a horrible mistake? Well,
yeah,
don't shame them for making that mistake. No, the fact is that in order to help people, sometimes you are going to have to paint harsh realities.
yeah.
And when those realities are overwhelmingly backed up by statistics, as this is,
Mm.
it becomes all the more demented to keep quiet.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So that's why we've absolutely got to continue to talk about these things. I wanted to get into some controversial things that I have
Okay.
in your book, the most recent one, sex. Where did you get the idea for that book? You know, what was your sort of reason for writing it? Was it that you'd noticed certain patterns, or was it more, you know, are you trying to make a statement with this book? You know, what's the sort of idea behind it? If you had to put it
Okay.
fairly bluntly.
Okay. Well, to put it bluntly, um, sex is central to most people's lives. People obsess over it. A lot of people's lives are changed for the better or worse as a result of it.
Mm,
Um, Entire billion-dollar industries revolve around it, and yet most people don't know the basic history of where all of the anatomy and instincts and cultural things came from. They
yeah.
just don't know, which is crazy when you consider how central it is to people's lives. Now, there have been histories of sex written before. Most of them are basically, oh, look at the funny chastity cages some people used to wear in the 19th century. Or here's the invention of the first vibrator used to cure
Right.
female hysteria originally. We can double back to that if you like.
Yeah, that would be great.
And yeah, and then there's a few other sex histories that do the ancient stuff. So the eroticism of the Greco-Romans and so forth. And then there's a third genre of sex history which purely talks about primates. So like how primates behaved and how that sort of relates to us humans in terms of the gap of instincts and sort of trying to bridge the gap rather to show what connects. And that's a lot about bonobos being essentially the hippies who make love and not war and aren't
Right.
violent because they're having sex all the time, and uh, often contrasted to chimpanzees who are sort of the exact opposite. But no one did the full run from the start of sex right up to modern day to show how all of those puzzle pieces fit together. And
Yeah.
that's my specialty is bird's eye view of natural and human history. So I thought, well, I've done the universe one, and this will be a bit of fun. And I think I'll be able to bust out a lot of interesting facts that'll surprise people, some of which, sort of left out during my research.
I definitely want to hear about why is it, do you think, that no one's pieced together the pieces? Is it just because the sort of vibrator that fixed all of the women's hysteria is much more uh I don't know, appealing
All
for
of those
people?
things all of those things are worthy of mention, but the thing about academia is it's very siloized. It's very specialized. So you will be a specialist in, say, 19th century literature, which, with a bit of inventiveness, allows you to maybe write about the evolution of the history of sex in 19th century London.
Yeah.
There's a very good book that was written just in the last 2 years that focuses on that. And then there's, biologists who wouldn't be able to write about human history, but will be able to write about primates and the evolution of sex in that context. My entire discipline, my entire academic education was synthesis and taking all of those things and putting them together and finding broad patterns. So it was relatively easy for me to do it. Most people in academia are not trained that way. And
Okay.
and they haven't been since the 19th century, where we've gotten more and more specialized. We've been put into our little silos, which
Yeah.
is a shame, because I've sat down and collaborated with people from all sorts of different disciplines and come up, sitting in that room with these people, come up with ideas and insights that there's no way we would have come up with if we'd just been in separate rooms with our own specialties. So you
Yeah.
can get a bit blinkered there. So that's why it hadn't been done, and that's why I did it. As for vibrators being invented to cure hysteria, hysteria was a sort of a medical condition attributed to women that was around since the ancient Greeks, and originally it involved.
Isn't it originally
And
borderline, it's borderline personality disorder, isn't it? Hysteria.
the Greeks used to think that behavioral problems in women were caused by the uterus detaching and floating around the human body.
Whoa. What?
Yeah, the Greeks got a lot of things right, but they got a lot of things wrong.
Wow.
Um,
That sounds
like they
painful.
Yeah. Well, the clue's in the name, hysteria, as in hysterectomy. Um,
Mm.
yeah. So all of that is there. But then in the 19th century, they no longer believed that the uterus detached, but they thought it was a uniquely female condition that caused everything from anger to weeping to from either being frigid or to being excessively amorous. It was across the board, and so women frequently got diagnosed with hysteria. And one of the cures that was floated in the mid to late 19th century was genital massage.
Okay.
And uh, that would have been done by a treating doctor, usually manually, using his fingers. So, as a treatment for hysteria, some doctors were doing what to women, and uh, and certainly that seemed to calm those women down. But then, of course, it was a matter of
What was
doctors.
there any kind of science behind that? Or, because obviously that would stimulate an orgasm, and then I guess the idea would be that the hormones, is oxytocin and serotonin, right, that gets released in an
Yes.
orgasm? Yeah, so was that the kind of theory that the release of those hormones was meant to calm the hysteria? But then again, wouldn't that what were they then suggesting as the hysteria? Are they saying it's
I think it was more of a matter of guess and test. So someone
right?
had that right idea, and it seemed to work, and so they kept doing it. But this is so eventually, it became a matter of bulk. You had all of these patients who needed treating for hysteria, and doctors were starting to get cramps in their hands, literally. So they invented the first vibrator
Okay.
that
Right.
was used to stimulate women without actually,
And when was this?
mechanically. That was the late 19th century. Vibrators were also utilized originally to be massages for the back and prescribed solely to men. The guy who originally invented it didn't want women to use it because he suspected what women might use it for.
Mm.
Um, and these back massagers were on the market until about 1920, when in the United States, when they caught on to, oh no, women are using these as masturbatory aids,
Yeah.
and they were made illegal, I think, until the 60s or 70s again. So
So the
yeah,
hysteria
so
thing went out the window at that point, I would
oh
imagine.
yeah, yes, hysteria was thoroughly discredited in the 20th century in the
Is that
medical establishment.
I'm just really intrigued by the whole hysteria thing. Is that something that you know much on? Have you looked into
Well, I know my fair share, just having over the course of writing the book, but it was just a sort of an easy diagnosis for doctors to slap on any sort of female mood disorder, whether that be hormonal, whether it be postpartum, whether it be
Mm.
a chick with borderline personality disorder
Yeah.
or bipolar. They might all be classified as being hysterical. Another
Could it
treatment for
also be
hysteria.
a lack of a lack of understanding perhaps in the differences between men and women? Because I know, for example, women are far more neurotic than
Yeah,
men. So do you reckon there was probably a lot of women perhaps back then that were getting the diagnosis of hysteria, but maybe it was just that compared to the
their
average
pattern of
person?
behavior.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. There was another treatment for hysteria, which was the rest cure, which was literally you forced a woman to lie in bed for weeks at a time and not talk to anyone or do anything, read anything, and they were just supposed to sit there and rest. And that was apparently supposed to be the cure for hysteria. That sounds like psychological torture, but that was a fairly common treatment as well.
I
You weren't
mean,
even allowed to talk to the nurse who came in to bring you food and change your bedpan. You were just supposed to lie there and do nothing. It was very zen.
I was gonna
Um,
say it sounds to me a bit more like sort of Eastern philosophy type, go into the forest, come out a shaman type thing. So
yes.
some might hear torture, some might hear Buddhist retreat. I heard Buddhist retreat, but then the whole bedpan thing threw me off.
But yeah, the,
Um,
the, the, the 19th century is replete with medical quackery like that. Um,
yeah, it seems like there wasn't much thought behind it. It was more just let's try this and see if it works, and if it does, great.
uh,
Let's go with it.
there was another treatment where there was this guy in South France in the 1920s who was inserting baboon testicles into the scrotums of men in order to treat impotence.
Whoa.
And that doesn't graft at all, and that's utterly stupid. But that he ran for a few years doing that. The treatment for male and female masturbation, males, it was advocated to have a circumcision. It was not for religious purposes, but just to remove the foreskin with, reduce the number of nerve endings.
Yeah.
That one did catch on in the United States. A big proponent of that was the cornflakes guy. What
What do
was
you
his
mean?
name? The guy who invented cornflakes, um, and his brother. They were big crusaders against masturbation.
Okay.
Um, and the same guys also advocated to curb female masturbation, to apply carbolic acid to the clitoris. burning it off. So yeah, that one didn't catch on, but some women did undergo that treatment. There were also treatments that involved the removal of the clitoris with a pair of scissors. I think, no, that was another treatment for hysteria, now that I think about it. So the horrors of 19th century science in relation to sex, there's lots of it. I
Why do
feel
you
we're
think
getting a
that
little
was that
sidetracked.
people were sort of so against masturbation? Where is that idea come from?
Well, I think it's sort of a holdover from sort of the constraints put on sex during the agrarian period,
Mm,
where you wanted to do that. There was a motivation to do that to a certain extent because sex essentially had to do with family alliances, property contracts, and
yeah,
if you're a poor peasant farmer. Getting married and making sure that the kids you have are yours and your
yeah,
family stays stable and that your kids are your heirs and they're going to inherit the farm after you. That's your lifeblood, because if you lose your farm, you could starve to death. You could be a pauper. There's no social safety net.
yeah,
So the constraints on sex became sort of impossible, but they also became enshrined in religion. Most religions, particularly the closer you move to modernity, became sort of very sort of sex negative. And so what you have um, in the 19th century is the growth of science, the
mm,
growth of the scientific method, but all these old attitudes sort of intervening, and doctors still feeling their way as to what works and what doesn't. Really, the medical field as it currently stands, where they actually do more good than harm, is a very recent thing.
mm.
Germ theory is a very recent thing. They were still doing bloodletting at the beginning of the 19th century.
What's
You
that?
know, bloodletting, they thought it was a cure to for most diseases and ailments, where a doctor would come in and literally cut open your skin and bleed you into a bowl to get rid of the foul humors that were polluting your blood. They'd remove your blood, even though the white blood cells in your blood might actually be helping to cure you.
Right.
So there was an idea before sort of the mid 19th century where, you know, the doctor was just as likely to kill you as cure you, because of what he might come in with suggesting. So
Wow.
yeah, it was a different world back then.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely didn't know that that was a thing, at least not as recent as you're saying it was. So,
Early
yeah,
19th century. Yeah.
at least we're moving somewhat in the right direction. I'm really intrigued to go back to your first book that sort of took the bird's eye view, um,
Okay.
on the universe. I have a question. So, I'm I read the book from Kip Thorne, the physicist Kip Thorne, where he spoke about the film Interstellar, and he spoke about how he came up with the ideas for the film Interstellar. I'm not sure if you've seen the film, but
I have, yeah.
it's my absolute favorite film ever. So I
Okay.
bought the book because I was intrigued by the science in it, and I wanted to know, sort of how accurate it was and how likely, certain things were, especially with regard to black holes. So I wanted to ask you on your view with black holes. My understanding, at least from the film and from Kip Thorne's book, is he has this theory that beyond the event horizon, you sort of access this hyperspace. He calls it the bulk, which is essentially just a space of higher dimensions. There's also other
Mhm.
people who have these ideas of, like, beyond the event horizon, maybe that's where we get things like the multiverse, and that in fact inside each black hole is another universe of its own with its own laws of physics, and maybe this universe is inside beyond the event horizon of a black hole. These are all just theories that I've heard. Now, I know this is pure speculation and we can, at this point in time, never know for sure. But what is your current understanding or hypothesis of what's beyond the event horizon of a black hole?
All right. Well, the thing about black holes is it's very fertile ground for pretty much any plausible sounding scientific theory.
Yeah,
um, Pure speculation, but that's because of the nature of black holes, where eventually they essentially subvert physics and time
yeah,
as we understand them. The thing you have to, and I have heard another theory about which used black holes to sort of describe a system of universal natural selection, where black holes would essentially be the connections to a multiverse where universes are popping in and out of existence all the time, and being naturally selected towards producing more black holes than
Yeah,
less.
I think I've heard that one too. Yeah.
Yeah. But all of this is based on what exactly? The fact that black holes are essentially a big pile of matter, like a big dumpster pile of matter. And so much matter that the gravity is so intense that light cannot escape, and it bends time, and that's all we know about it. It's so in its simplest conception, it's just a big pile of stuff.
Mm,
That's it. And not portals to Narnia. Um, and this is evidenced by the fact that they do give off radiation.
yeah.
They decay just like everything else and will disappear like everything else
Yeah.
at the heat of the universe many, many years from now, like trillions, trillions, trillions times a trillion, 38 times. But they will disappear. So uh, the thing is, I've not really been dependent on black holes in my thinking about, say, the multiverse,
Mm,
because the most dominant multiverse model has nothing to do with black holes or dimensions living on top of each other or anything like that. Um, the thing about Big Bang cosmology is it doesn't work without a thing called eternal inflation. So this guy in the 80s named Alan Guth or Guth um, figured out that in order for the cosmic inflation of the universe after in the first split second
mhm.
after the Big Bang, in order for that to work, that inflation would have to continue rapidly. And we're talking about going from smaller than an atom to the size of a grapefruit in
Yeah.
the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
That vast acceleration, expansion, the universe, by the way, does not expand that fast, the visible universe. But that expansion elsewhere beyond the visible universe would still need to be happening at that immense rate that happened in the first split second of the universe. Now, what that means is the universe itself, the observable universe, is about 93 billion light years across
Mhm.
at the present time. But beyond the observable universe, there would be a lot of inflationary space where uh, other sort of bubbles like ours, our visible universe, would be popping out of inflationary space with entirely different sets of physical laws and constants and dimensions to our own. So that's the model where essentially inflationary space is expanding very rapidly eternally, and new universes are coming into existence all the time. And each one of them will have physical laws different to our own. Some of them will be very different. Some of them will be slightly different. So the ones that are very different might not have matter or might have organisms, but like you and me, except our skin looks like pepperoni pizza for some reason, just because of the change of the physical laws. There would be universes where you and I are having this conversation 1.5 seconds earlier and 1.5 seconds later. There would be universes where you don't exist. There would be universes where I don't exist. There would be universes with no light, no nothing, no anything. Um, and that pretty much any possibility, the essence of the multiverse. But that is not dependent on there being hidden dimensions over top our own. That is not dependent on black holes being portals to Narnia.
Okay.
So they easily black holes could easily have properties because they do bend space and time in just a horrifically twisted kind of way. That it could result in properties that are would appear to us somehow magical,
Yeah.
or it could just be a big hole that you jump into and you're crushed out of existence immediately.
Yeah. I guess my question
So
for the whole black hole thing, obviously I'm aware that they over a long, long time they evaporate. It's through Hawking radiation, right?
mhm,
Um, I guess I have a question about Hawking radiation. Does that account for all of the mass that essentially gets eaten up by the black hole? So, for example, things that get sucked into it, you know, does Hawking radiation account for that stuff? Does that stuff
yes.
essentially come back out? Is that does that come into Hawking radiation?
Yes, it eventually will all come back out. As a
Right.
black hole evaporates, everything it eats
Mm,
will eventually get spat back out again in a form of weak radiation, which
right.
in the heat death scenario is the ultimate fate of the universe, just equally distributed weak orb of energy
Okay, I think
everywhere.
that's where my lack of understanding was coming from because I think I was presuming that Hawking radiation only accounted for the original mass of what the black hole, the sun that the black hole would have been before. I didn't realize that it actually accounted for everything else that got sucked in. So cool. Okay.
Uh, what I mean, you're talking about the black holes. The whole thing is it's a big pile of matter. So if you throw more matter into the black hole, you're just giving it more fuel to burn over the course of the next 10 to the power of 100 years.
Right.
But
Okay.
eventually it burns through it all, but it burns through very, very slowly. In fact,
Yeah.
everything else, all the matter in the universe will have already evaporated into energy long before black holes evaporate. Like the entire lifespan of the universe will happen again between the evaporation of matter and the evaporation of black holes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
how slow and slight Hawking radiation is, and that's just how much matter is in a black hole.
Right. Okay. No, that
How much
makes
matters.
sense. And when you
Yeah.
talk about, I want to try and wrap my head around this idea of, you say beyond the observable universe.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this is the way that I've understood it from what you've said. So you've got the Big
Okay.
Bang, right?
Yeah.
And you do you think the Big Bang is likely the beginning of the universe? Because I know that there's a bunch of different scientists who, some people don't even think that it happened, some people think it did. It's like the whole evolution thing. Some people think it's a thing, some people don't. So the way that I've heard what you said is essentially you had the Big Bang, and
Yeah.
then you had space smaller than the size of an atom, essentially going into a grapefruit. And then we've got our observable universe, which is however many light years across. How
93
does
billion.
93 billion?
Yeah.
How
At the present
how
time.
how does space come outside of that? Where does that come from? Does that then suggest that the space there was there before the Big Bang?
No. No. The space is contained within the universe that expanded. The space is the universe did not fill a void. The space itself is within that universe. So let me put it this way: if you were to picture the singularity as a dot on a piece of paper,
Yeah.
right? So the very early universe is just that tiny dot you make with your pencil. Take a pair of scissors and cut all the paper around it, because that's not physically accurate. That the rest of the sheet of paper did not exist. We're
Okay.
talking no space, no nothing outside the universe. Space is a property of the universe itself. It's something that's
Yes.
happening in the cosmos as it expands. So no, there's no black void. There's no space around the singularity. There's just that little pinprick. That's it.
So then with the theory of the multiverse, would that then mean that the multiverse has to exist inside an initial universe anyway?
That means that the multiverse was there in that pinprick at the same time as well. Um,
Right.
but this is the most credible multiverse model because it's dependent on the things that validate Big Bang cosmology, where you've got our universe with its physical properties, what's visible to us,
Mm,
right? And then you've got inflationary space, which is a mathematical inevitability of it's an inevitable conclusion of Big Bang cosmology,
okay.
where in distant space beyond the observable universe, you've got rapidly expanding space. It all expanded after the Big Bang,
Mhm.
after the Big Bang. But you've got different universes that are essentially popping into existence elsewhere, many trillions and quadrillions of light years from our universe, with different physical properties. So, multiverse in that sense is a misnomer because universe is supposed to mean the totality.
Right.
But if we take universe just to mean the cosmos that we can see,
Yeah.
that 93 billion light years across cosmos, then yes, the multiverse would be those other little bubbles, or to use another analogy, like holes in Swiss cheese,
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
these different universes are popping into existence with different properties. So all of that is post Big Bang. So there's not like a wider cosmos or network of universes with multiple Big Bangs. There's just
Right.
one.
Right. Okay. So what does that mean for when you look at things like string theory? I know they're trying to find this unifying theory, the answer that would link sort of Einstein's equations to, say, quantum physics. What does that mean for that? Because if you've got this one big bang, and then that big bang is the multiverse, and we
Yeah.
are in our observable universe inside that multiverse, if
Hmm.
all of the different universes inside the multiverse have their own laws of physics, then surely
Hmm.
that would mean it's impossible to find a one unifying theory.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things to say to that. So the grand unified theory, or GUT, is basically finding a way to unify the four fundamental laws of physics:
Yeah,
gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear
yeah,
forces. Now, they've already managed to unify electromagnetic and weak nuclear. They call
yeah,
it the electroweak. Gravity is really the hard one to bring into the other three.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and so you could do that. You could come up with a grand unified theory, potentially without looking at the multiverse. You could just do it based on our physics and our universe. Okay. But now, string theory has actually been sort of outmoded. It's out of fashion for the last decade.
Oh,
They've began turning toward M theory, which is slightly different. But M theory postulates that there are about 10 to the power of 500 different possible sets of physical laws. So that's to say, we're not talking 10 to the power of 500 different universes. We're talking 10 to the power of 500 different combinations, different balances of elements of the intensity of gravity, or not having gravity at all, but having something else. 10 to the power of 500, which is more than there are atoms in the universe, many times over. And so that would be the number of different possible sets of physical laws that could govern the rules of a particular bubble inside of the multiverse. Um, so now, could you come up with a grand unified theory for all the 10 to the power of 500? Probably not. I mean, probably not. A human certainly wouldn't be capable of it. A computer that we build certainly wouldn't be capable of it, which is why a lot of physicists hate the fact that eternal inflation is currently a consequence, an inevitable consequence of Big Bang cosmology, because they hate the idea of the universe not being governed by one single set of
mm.
laws,
Yeah,
but
that
varying
irritates me.
beyond
I
its
can't
borders.
lie.
Yeah. But like the fact is that it is or it isn't. I'd be interested either way.
Yeah, I mean, can we prove, sort of theoretically, mathematically, the concept of eternal inflation? Is that
You can
something?
prove it. You can prove it mathematically. That was done 40 years ago.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
proving the existence of other universes in a multiverse, that is almost impossible to prove empirically.
Why is
It's
that?
it's
Why is it impossible to prove empirically?
uh, because we're talking about seeing, by definition, universes beyond our observable universe. Now, there are a few sort of attempts that have been made. One, if you were to map the sky for sort of essentially the first snapshot of light, which occurred 380,000 years after the Big Bang, where light was able to move freely through the universe.
Mhm.
It's called cosmic microwave background. It's
Yeah,
everywhere you look in the universe.
yeah.
And if you look at certain patterns in that, people have looked at it and said, well, no, this might be evidence that there was another universe. There's the mysterious cold spot in
Yeah, yeah.
CM, which some people have postulated, well, that might have been where there was another universe next to ours, another little bubble at the earliest moments of the Big Bang that was sort of touching us and then moved away.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Entirely hypothetical. You couldn't prove that unless we got a lot better photographing and measuring CMB. Now, there is another definitive proof, but we'd have to wait a few trillion years. So, if there was a universe near to ours uh, at shortly after the Big Bang, before it
Yeah.
moved away from us, then if that universe is physically capable of uh, light,
Mm.
then we would see the light from that other universe in about 3 trillion years.
How what how how have we come to that conclusion that we would see the light from
Okay,
it?
so really hypothetically, and
Yeah.
this is just to highlight how absurd and unprovable the entire realm of multiverse theory is. Okay,
Okay.
but if like you got your Big Bang, right?
Mhm.
So cosmic inflation, Gouthian cosmic inflation, and suddenly, so the universe is accelerating very fast. Here's our observable universe that's
Yeah.
slow; it's expanding a lot slower. But then
Mhm.
there was another one that maybe it popped into being shortly after ours did. So it's very close to us, just at the
Mhm.
beginning. So they're both expanding, but they're moving away from each other, just many times faster than the speed of light, absurdly fast. You
Okay.
know, well, if in those earliest moments, this universe here was physically capable of shining light,
Okay.
um, or even 380,000 years after, like ours was, then we would be able to see somewhere 3 trillion years from now, because light does travel,
Hmm.
right? But it travels at a certain speed.
Yes.
Then 3 trillion years from now, roughly, you would be able to see that first light very distantly in our sky. It would be the most distant object in our sky. Light transmitted from a very distant ancient universe. Just like the further you look into the sky, the older the galaxies get. And if you look
Right.
far enough back, you're looking at quasars.
Yes.
That would be the same idea with this multiverse, but we'd have to wait 3 trillion years to find out. So yeah, that's how difficult it would be to prove any of this multiverse shit. Sorry, unless there's some advancement in science, which so don't think I'm a naysayer. There's advancements in scientific investigation all the time, but
Mhm.
it would be tricky to say the least.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks for humoring my curiosity nonetheless, because I didn't know of the end theory thing. I thought string theory was still quite a popular idea. So
Well,
good to
I'm
have a
sure
sense of that.
I'm sure it still has its adherents, but Stephen Hawking turned up his nose to it about a decade ago, and I'll defer to him. So,
Fair enough. I can't really blame you for that. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of final things that I wanted to get to um is perhaps to sort of bring it back down to earth. I have a habit of getting away with things. So thank you for going into that side of things because that fascinates me. But to bring it
it,
back
it
back down to earth,
it's
I
interesting. It's interesting to have that part of the conversation. It's something I've been doing for years, but yeah, not strictly speaking, gender dynamics, sex, or red pill related. But hopefully, the listeners are interested nonetheless.
yeah, no,
Uh,
I hope we've still got a few viewers who have managed to strive on through that segment
yeah,
of the interview.
yeah.
But to bring it back down to earth and to go back to gender dynamics, are there any sort
Mhm.
of important issues or patterns that you've noticed, whether it be in your book or in your research, that you think is something important to highlight today?
All right. Well, one of the main things is the sort of our evolutionary legacy of polygyny, and how because of cultural circumstances we're sort of heading back into a quasi polygyny today.
Okay,
So
what do you mean
um
by that?
okay, so polygyny, one man, many women. Gorillas, who we had a common ancestor with about 12 million years ago, they're polygynous. Many different old world monkey species. In fact, I think the majority of them are polygynous.
Okay.
So it's a strong impulse. Even within promiscuous species like chimpanzees, there's alphas and there's betas, and the alphas get more sex.
Mhm.
So, and bonobos are an offshoot of chimpanzees. We're more closely related to chimps than we are bonobos. They're sort of an exception to that, where sort of everyone's having sex as a way of socialization and resolving tension. But within humans, we of course evolved monogamy 2 million years ago, but we still have these impulses in us. So when we invented agriculture, as I mentioned, there was constraints put on sexuality, and we formalized monogamy. There was certainly a formalization of monogamy in hunter-gatherer societies,
Yes.
um, especially when we're dealing with intertribal marriage. But it became even more intensified once we get to agriculture and civilization.
Right.
Okay, because suddenly we're dealing with sedentary populations with inheritance and property. So suddenly these things matter a lot more. Progeny and all that matters. But what's happened in modernity is we sort of cut the reins again. So whereas 100, 200 years ago, most men would be able to rest easy with the idea that, yes, I will find a woman
Mhm.
and I'll be able to marry her. and will stay together for life. Now men completely robbed of that certainty.
Yeah.
Uh, because and this is not it's not an accident that, people quote the dating app data, which says that, 80 women find 80% of men unattractive.
Yeah.
That is a relic of our evolutionary past. The same would be the case, give or take a few percentage points, in a horde of baboons, where there's just a certain subset of males that are favored by females, and the other men have to work for it, essentially.
Right.
And it's the case with us. So what's happening in society today is the rise of sort of a quasi polygyny, and I say quasi because we aren't gorillas.
Mm.
We do have monogamous instincts, and they are quite strong, which is why you're not seeing is the end result of sort of the end of traditionalism being guys having multiple wives. It happens as a religious mandate in the Muslim world, but
Mm.
in the West, that's not just releasing all pressure. That's not the end game, where it's just all the alpha chads of the world are having multiple wives. Most of them are winding up with one woman or none at all, right? If they decide to be womanizers. But
Yeah.
most of them, the Chad has his Stacy, and then all the other girls who are chasing him
Yeah.
wind up left out, right? At which point they're aging and they're less likely to find someone, so they settle for a guy who
Mm.
they might ultimately resent, or they join the ranks of the growing number of involuntary childless,
Yeah.
uh, or at the very least, they become single mothers, or um, essentially they run out the clock when it comes to their fertility. So that seems to be where we're headed in terms of the overall model of sex and relationships. Is sort of a quasi polygyny. It's like an aborted polygyny where women are gravitating toward a subset of males,
Mm.
with a lot of males being left on the sidelines. But then, whereas males are disadvantaged in their 20s, women seems to be running into the disadvantages in their 30s because they're getting jerked around. They're not winning the game of musical chairs. Only one woman can win, right?
Yeah.
So that seems to be the pattern that strikes across both natural and human history, straight into modernity. So that's one issue, and that's sort of another contributor to the drop in the fertility rate. Is not only is it because women are sort of spending a good chunk of their fertility window now working on their careers,
Yeah.
they're also spending it not just being promiscuous, but they're also spending it. Let's say they want a relationship, but they're all gravitating toward the same guy, which is sort of a function of dating apps, but also a function of sort of the increasing compartmentalization of society.
Hmm.
Um, One of the big things is the fact that we're not chatting each other up anymore,
Yeah.
because an increasing amount of courtship, for lack of a better term, is happening online. Um, Men are not able to display traits that would mark them out as good partners, protectors, and providers. You can't really demonstrate for the fact that you're funny, considerate, insightful, intelligent, good with your money, or a good listener, or have a clear view of the future, from a dating app where you've got half a dozen photos and a one-line bio that no one's going to read.
Exactly.
So that's why, on dating apps, you've got the market essentially zeroing in on, well, is he cute, or does he look like he have money? He has
Yeah.
money. Now that won't apply to all women to go on dating apps. Some I'm sure are very discerning, but that it's sort of weighted in that direction. Whereas if you met a woman in a bar 30 years ago,
Yeah.
there's so much that goes into that interaction, and not even just spoken interaction, but even the pheromones
Yeah.
can play a role, and we've lost that. So,
Also,
you
doesn't
know,
that then pose problems for I read somewhere, I'm probably gonna absolutely slaughter this, but I read somewhere that it's important for women, men and women, to mate with people whose immune systems are genetically dissimilar to theirs, because it is supposed to mean that immune system then of the child is likely to be better because you've got the combination of the two immune systems. If we're doing everything online, doesn't it then mean that I don't know if it's through pheromones or what, but our bodies can't exactly sense the genetic similarities or differences as well?
Well, mating with someone with a different immune system is more luck of the draw
Right.
than it is sort of a guarantee that you're going to be more attracted to someone who has a different set of immunities than you.
Because I know that they
If
found with women who came off of contraception, hormonal contraception, they found that they tended to be more attracted then to people who had a different immune system. Whereas when they were on the contraception, they were actually attracted to men who were
the same type.
more similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's more broadly to do with genetic diversity than
Hmm.
just your basic immunity. Um, if you if it came down to like a magnetic attraction to someone with a different immune system from yours, we would see a lot more interracial marriage than we do. It would actually be the most
Okay.
dominant form of hooking up, when in fact it's a very tiny minority. I think about 3 or 4%.
Okay.
So, because of course different cultures, different bloodlines, different heredities will develop different immunities to different diseases because they hail from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
So that, but the thing is, it's a general advantage of sexual reproduction that by luck of the draw of genetics, you will be more likely to develop immunities toward diseases than if you were just a single asexual
Yeah.
being cloning yourself.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, it's an advantage of sex, but it's not a magnetic driver in and of itself.
I sort of you mentioned obviously the quasi polygyny,
Yeah.
and obviously the fact that courtship is happening online, and this is essentially a problem for us, which I
Mhm.
don't think many people would argue with that. I think that that's a
Yeah,
pretty
I,
basic
I
thing.
I would say that that's the interesting thing is when it comes to the problems of sex and relationships and modernity, most different factions in society, people with different perspectives, politically, religiously, they all seem to recognize there is a problem. They seem to broadly recognize numbers indicating the problem rather, but the prescriptions seem to be very different. So, and I think that's where a discussion should be happening between groups, and not one with acrimony. But of course, on Twitter, it seems to be blood sports is the way to make yourself famous. So we all just shout at each other,
Yeah.
but the prescription is different. But so like when it comes to families and divorce rates, you'll get traditional conservatives deploring the current system of divorce, but encouraging men to marry anyway,
Yeah.
um, even though they might get destroyed in divorce court. You get MGTOWs and Red Pill who will say, well, no, men are going to continue to avoid marriage in increasing numbers until there is reform. And that seems to be a major disconnect between TradCons and Red Pill at the moment. That seems to be the dominant
There
debate.
seems to be no middle ground. I've definitely noticed that pattern as well. It's it seems to be two ends of the extremes. You've got on the one end, well, we can acknowledge the facts and the state of things, but we're still going to tell you to do it anyway. Then you've got the other end that is acknowledging the facts and the state of things, but saying, well, okay, that means that we're just going to almost stop the fight. If that makes sense, they just want to say, like, don't do anything about it, which I get. I completely understand the MGTOW guys, because if you're fed up with something, why would you continue to put yourself in a position where you're ultimately going to lose? It's like a business deal. If you have a business deal that the odds are all against you, you're probably not going to go into that deal. But I guess my to wrap this up, my final question would be, what is your prescription? How do we move forward from this? If you had to sort of give a way for people to start being able to have these constructive conversations, without sort of going for blood, what do you think
Oh God.
the way
Well, I
forward
mean, like
is?
I have no prescription for people not being inflammatory tribal idiots. I'm sorry, people are going to shout at each other till the end of time.
Yeah.
But ultimately, out of that chaos, generally speaking, via debate, the strongest argument tends to win out in the end. Um, uh,
So it's all about
like,
engagement.
yeah, well, I mean, like when two people debate on a stage, it's not really about them trying to convince each other. It's about the audience listening to their
Yes.
arguments.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was interesting to me in that recent debate uh, between Pearl and other red pillars and the tradcons over at
Yeah.
Daily Wire
They
was
weren't responding.
ju- just how feeble the arguments from the Daily Wire actually were on the subject of divorce reform and the risks of marriage, which is interesting because the Daily Wire are certainly no wimps. They come out
Yeah.
with very strong arguments on a number of issues, and yet there it just seemed to be failing, and it seemed to be reflected in the comments in certain Twitter threads, but also on the videos that various speakers put out. The video put out by Shapiro on the subject, the comments are almost entirely against him in terms of
Yeah,
what he
the
was saying.
same with Matt Walsh's one. I looked at his comments briefly on this conversation.
Yeah.
And it's surprising when you have obviously like, these figures. I'm a fan of the Daily Wire, on most
Mhm.
things.
Yeah.
Perhaps not on this particular issue, but it's surprising when you see figures as big as them, where the majority of comments are in fact against them. Because usually with most other topics, it's their audience, so the comments are usually in their favor. So it's really interesting when you see that the comments are actually against them. And I think actually that speaks more to the debate itself, the fact that they're not really willing to engage on this. And I guess the whole kind of mindset of that is, Jordan Peterson says it all the time of, uh, declaring it as an act of faith. Perhaps they're just sort of not wanting to engage on the topic because I think most of them are married and they just want to sort of say, well, we're married and we want it to work for us. So maybe they don't want to engage in the conversation because I don't know, maybe they don't want to jinx it almost. They almost don't want to jinx that it could go wrong. I don't know if that could be it.
It would be a thrilling exercise to sit here and psychoanalyze them as to their motivations, but I don't think we have enough time. But
No.
I will say this, that um, so when it comes to shouting each other, I think ultimately you've got to look at sort of what arguments carry the day, and I think that the audience in this regard is uh, on the right path in the majority. In that, yeah, that most people do recognize, right or left, recognize that we do need divorce reform. So that's just one example of one debate. But in terms of prescriptions as to the wider future, I will say, just as a disclaimer, that when I work as a historian, when I write a history, when I put out a book, I tend just to the best of my ability present the facts, the state of play as they exist, and keep my own private convictions, which are strong, fairly
Yeah.
muted. But that's not to say I won't discuss them publicly. That's just in the book itself. That's for you to read the information and then come away and draw your own conclusions.
Yeah.
Um, but when it comes to actual prescriptions as to what to do about current state of things, I mean, I have a number of ideas on specific ideas as to what divorce reform could look like. I have a number of ideas about how one could increase fertility rates in the West again. There's a number of things we could discuss there. Also about how to increase the marriage rate again, how to reduce the divorce rate, how to change the sort of horrific quasi-polygynous situation that dating apps have put us in. There's a number of things to discuss, and some of them might be good ideas, some of them might be bad, but it's certainly a discussion worth having,
Yeah.
calmly and rationally, at
That's
some
it.
point.
No, I completely agree. I think the only way to move forward in anything, like you say, is for us to be able to engage in a debate and then ultimately everyone can make up their own minds for themselves. But people need to be willing to engage and talk publicly about this stuff for any kind of change to even begin to happen. So perhaps we will get you back maybe on some kind of panel. Maybe we can do a debate on divorce reform and see what everyone's ideas are, and see if anyone has any solutions, and perhaps we might come to a conclusion, perhaps we might not, but either way I think it might be a lot of fun. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. David Baker. Guys, make sure you go check out his book. I definitely will be having a read into it after today's conversation. So yeah, you can find the book. Is it on all sort of available book sites, Amazon?
All book sites, all the mainstream ones. You can get them on Amazon for sure, Booktopia, in bookstores in the UK in February. It's out in Australia as of October, but you can get it online now, and then it's in the rest of the world just in time for Valentine's Day. Sex, 2 billion years of procreation and recreation at fine booksellers everywhere.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll include a link in the description so that people can click a link and hopefully come
Very
to
kind.
the book on Amazon or whatever it may be. But
Sure.
yeah, no, thank you so much for today. I've really enjoyed it. It's definitely been a brain workout for me, which I love. So thank you for that. And yeah, why don't you let me all know what you think in the comments below. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up on your way out. Make sure to join in on the conversation. We've covered a wide array of topics here today. So if any of it was of any interest to you, I'd really appreciate you letting me know your thoughts on any of the topics we've discussed today. And yeah, hopefully we will be having more discussions with Dr. David Baker on some of these various topics. So yeah, if you like this video, make sure you like it on your way out, leave a comment below, share the video around, and be sure to subscribe to my channel to keep up to date with more interviews to come, and go check out my series Debunking the Lunacy, and I will see you over there.